One evening, when T. Dewey was exhorting, a flash of forked lightning pierced the air, and rolling thunder seemed to shake the house. Some screeched out for mercy. Some jumped out of windows, and others ran out the door. From this night, the stir became visible, and 13 of the youth that night resolved together to pursue religion. Lorenzo Dow, 1804.
Traveling the back roads from Canada to Mississippi, Methodist minister Lorenzo Dow preached sermons of fire and brimstone in churches, homes, tents, and open fields. Camp meetings, they called them. The thousands who attended were part of a second great awakening that swept American cities and frontiers in the early 1800s.
People were concerned with salvation, with whether they would be saved after death. More and more, this question loomed larger in the lives of people who were trying to deal with wrenching social changes.
And this was not a small issue. I mean, this is an age of ardent belief in eternal afterlife. And so facing damnation is not a trivial matter. It's forever, right? And you can't be a little wrong in religion. You're either right or you're damned. And people would get very, very wrought up about this.
Camp meetings became the way large numbers of people gathered in order to profess their faith in Jesus Christ and seek salvation for their souls.
Followers of Lorenzo Dow and others who were filled with religious devotion sought to reform themselves and their society. They believed they could revive the Republic by getting closer to God.
They were really aimed at getting people to inspect their own souls and to have a kind of rebirth, a kind of awakening, a spiritual awakening that would allow them to feel at peace and saved and sure, and that they were perfectible, that they could in fact reform themselves.
It was a message that reached from the poorest Americans to the most powerful politicians.
Man can be elevated. Man can become more and more endowed with divinity. And as he does, he becomes more godlike in his character and capable of governing himself. Andrew Jackson, 1828.
Women played important roles in church congregations, and a growing number sought to be official leaders. Jarena Lee, an African-American woman born in Philadelphia, believed God had called her to preach in her African Methodist Episcopal Church. Her pastor encouraged her to work and pray, but would not ordain her. In other churches, women could not speak or pray publicly when men were present. Facing these roadblocks, many women formed their own organizations and ministered to people through abolition, women's rights causes, anti-lynching crusades, and teaching. Would they bring heaven to earth? If they were to do so, the first thing they would have to eliminate was the scourge of demon rum.
I have just heard that my cousin Grange Owen is in Rochester jail for ill treatment of his wife and family, his wife having made a legal complaint. He refuses to get bail or give bonds for his future good conduct. I am satisfied that his conduct is bad and insufferable. It is caused in part by his drinking rum. Calvin Owen, Penfield, New York.
Rum and whiskey were cheap and plentiful in the early 1800s. Many Americans considered it healthful and nutritious.
It's hard to exaggerate, really, the level of drinking in the early Republic. It was a part of everybody's life. Women drank, children drank, men drank, everybody drank. Most of it was low-grade alcohol, but nevertheless, people drank an enormous amount, largely because the water wasn't any good. The water wasn't safe. And the only pure drink was something that you brewed.
Americans celebrated holidays with whiskey, brandies, and punches. They drank liquor to begin and end business negotiations. Workers often stopped at 11 and 4 o'clock for a shot of whiskey. Americans began drinking more whiskey than cider or punch. drunkenness increased, causing widespread complaints about its association with violence, crime, and family neglect.
Temperance was a very important issue for women because it connected to domestic violence. Women experience alcohol and heavy alcohol use in men as a source of disruption and danger for them and for their children. He gets angry and she gets hit. And this is a standard pattern that becomes a kind of signature story for the temperance movement.
The story is often focused on what happened to the poor wife and child of this guy who got drunk and spent all his wages drinking and then maybe came home drunk and maybe even was violent toward his family.
Camp meeting preachers gave congregations an earful about alcohol abuse. Reverend Lyman Beecher and others recommended total abstinence, that people not drink at all.
Temperance means not using alcohol to excess in a definitional way. What it meant socially was taking a pledge of total abstinence from alcohol, not letting a drop touch your lips.
Church groups and others formed temperance societies all across the country. Teetotalers swore to never drink alcohol again. Many women and young girls, the most likely victims of violent alcoholics, joined these societies and joined their rallies. The men usually permitted them only to listen rather than speak, but some women spoke out anyway.
One way to think of it is that women went public. They wouldn't have been seen on the streets, making speeches, organizing reform societies, or playing a very active role in the church, except as worshipers. But now women were assuming public voices, public roles. So we have female societies of all kinds, forming, meeting, distributing pamphlets, taking an active role in their communities. And they become extremely important in all the reform movements of the early 19th century.
I revolted in spirit against the customs of society and the laws of the state that crushed my aspirations and debarred me from the pursuit of almost every object worthy of an intelligent, rational mind. Emily Collins.
Husband and wife are one, and that one is the husband. William Blackstone, Commentaries.
What was life like for American women in the early 1800s? As a rule, women could not vote. They had no rights to their property or children, no voice in the laws that governed them. But much depended on where they lived and how much money they had. Out west, women forged trails alongside men, roped cattle, built cabins, hunted for food. Men appreciated their independent spirits because it helped make survival possible in the frontier. These women had more say in local government than most other American women.
Farm women had always had more of a say in their communities than urban women had, partly because women had more access to power out west, that they were important pioneers, that they were visible in the society in different ways.
They were among the first in the country to win the right to vote in national elections. In the slave South, on the other hand, men ruled. Women remained in traditional roles longer than in other places. Industrial life came slower to the South. Women were less likely to question the social structure. In the North, many middle-class women viewed their place as caretaker of the home and family as having religious significance.
Women were now supposed to be the ones responsible for retaining some kind of refuge from the rat race, the jungle, the world outside the home, and for instilling morals in young children. Women themselves became the repository of virtue. Women had to create the home. So women had to behave in ways where they could create this moral and virtuous space. They could never look like they were self-seeking. They could never look like they were interested in money. They could never look like any of those things.
Dozens of advice books told women how they should dress, behave, decorate their home, and care for their children to please their husbands and God. Dress was uncomfortable, restrictive, and even unhealthy.
Women had become a kind of symbol for the status of the men in their lives. So if you could afford to have a wife who wore a corset, it meant that she didn't have to move around a lot. She didn't have to do any manual labor. She didn't have to clean up after herself. She was a woman of leisure.
Of all Americans, African American women, free or slave, had the fewest rights. They were, in fact, defined in a separate category of existence altogether.
The racial tensions got greater and greater as the 19th century progressed, and there were always some groups of white women who wanted to retain distinctions that gave them more privileges than black women did.
As a child growing up in Boston in the 1820s, Elizabeth Cady Stanton loved to ride horses and play hard with her brother. She mastered Greek and studied law in her father's office. Instead of praising her, he only said, "Oh, my daughter, I wish you were a boy." When the local boys left for college and careers, she stayed behind to fight with corsets and hairpins. Stanton eventually married an abolitionist and moved to upstate New York, but she never forgot the pain of being excluded. In 1848, she met with Lucretia Mott and Jane Hunt over tea in Waterloo, New York, to plan a women's convention.
The Women's Rights Convention at Seneca Falls was the first time that a group of women and men had gotten together in public to discuss women's rights.
They discussed women's grievances about property, access to education and professional careers, and the low status of women in most churches.
The right to vote was the most controversial thing they asked for.
A right which they complained was given to the most ignorant and degraded men. They wrote a document called the Declaration of Sentiments, using the style and format of the Declaration of Independence.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights.
It was a set of grievances that women had worked over and figured out, a set of things they felt they were denied, rights they didn't have, property rights, voting rights, and other related rights. And that was the declaration that they issued at the end of the convention.
3 years later, Stanton would meet the other great leader of the women's suffrage movement, Susan B. Anthony of Rochester, New York. When she had attempted to speak at a temperance convention, Anthony was told that the ladies had been invited to listen and learn and not to speak. This led Anthony to the cause of women's rights. In 1851, Anthony and Stanton met at an anti-slavery rally and joined forces. Together, women formed associations to fight more effectively for women's rights, challenging everything from restrictive fashions to suffering imprisonment for illegal voting.
Women were not allowed to vote. And Anthony challenged this as a property holder and said, "I have a right to vote," and actually cast a ballot for which she got cast in jail.
We may, with no more propriety, assume to govern women than they might assume to govern us. Samuel May, 1846.
Some men joined the cause, while some women scorned it. It was here, in America's outdated and at times inhumane orphanages, insane asylums, and prisons, that American women were leading the crusade to reform the nation.